If you look closely at architectural maps from the mid-19th century, you'll notice a frightening anomaly that history textbooks remain silent about. Simultaneously, as if on command from a single center, construction of cyclopean complexes began in Europe, North America, and the Russian Empire. Officially, they were called poorhouses or mental hospitals. Historians try to convince us that humanity suddenly went mad en masse, but consider the absurdity of this assertion. For millennia, mental illnesses were isolated cases. Rural, insane people lived in communities, weren't isolated, and were pitied. And suddenly, just after 1850, the number of insane people soared into the hundreds of thousands. Is it possible for a biological species to lose its mind en masse in a single decade for no apparent reason? Or have the very criteria for what constitutes normality changed? Imagine yourself living in 1860. You survived the chaos of the cataclysm. You remember how, just 30 years ago, cities were illuminated without soot or oil by shining spires. You remember that your grandfather stood 2.5 meters tall and could lift stones too heavy for a horse. You try to tell this to your grandchildren, who are taught in the new schools that we descended from apes and have always lived in filth. You try to argue with a teacher, an official, a priest of the new church. And then there's a knock on your door. These aren't soldiers who will arrest you for rebellion that would create a hero martyr. These are doctors in starched lab coats. They do something even more terrifying than execution. They declare your memories hallucinations. This was the most elegant and cruel solution of the new elites who seized power from the ruins of Tartary. How to eliminate millions of witnesses of the Golden Age and the Great Catastrophe without turning the country into an obvious slaughterhouse. Simply declare their memory a disease. If someone claims that a dilapidated Roman aqueduct nearby is actually a functioning imperial hydroelectric power station, they are ill. If they talk about the free energy of the ether, they are delusional. If a woman cries for children forcibly taken away on the orphan train to an unknown destination, she is hysterical. A diagnosis became a death sentence that could not be contested, because the words of a madman have no legal force. The statistics of that time read like a war report. Between 1,850 and 1,880, the number of officially registered mentally ill people increased by thousands of percent. In England alone, the number of patients increased tenfold in just a couple of decades. This was not a brain epidemic. It was a memory epidemic. The psychiatric hospitals that sprang up like mushrooms on the outskirts of cities were not hospitals in the modern sense. They were filtration camps. Their sole purpose was to isolate carriers of the old code, engineers, philosophers, magicians, and simply long-lived people whose consciousness was resistant to being rewired with new, primitive dogmas. Look at the photographs of these buildings. Enormous red brick complexes resembling impenetrable fortresses. The Kirkbride plan, according to which these asylums were built in the United States, envisioned the creation of self-contained cities with no exit. Officially, this was done for humane treatment with fresh air. In reality, it was complete isolation from society. Those who were brought there were those too smart, too old, or too stubborn to accept the new reality, where a person is simply a cog in a coal-burning factory. The great explosion of madness was actually the great purge of truth. And the first victims of this punitive psychiatry were those who dared to recall out loud how bright the sun had been before the onset of nuclear winter. Take a close look at photographs of surviving 19th century mental hospitals. Trans-Allegheny in West Virginia, Danvers in Massachusetts, or abandoned complexes in the suburbs of St. Petersburg and London, what do you see? Your mind, hypnotized by history books, suggests the word hospital, but your eyes see something entirely different. You see palaces. You see majestic buildings with antique colonnades, spires soaring to the sky, intricate brickwork, and marble floors. We are told that these architectural masterpieces were built specifically to house the mentally ill, vagrants, and epileptics. Consider the monstrous inconsistency of this legend. At a time when ordinary workers lived in wooden barracks without sanitation, and kings spent years building their residences, governments allegedly spent colossal budgets to build castles for the dregs of society that surpassed Versailles in luxury. It sounds absurd because it's a lie. No one built these buildings in the mid-19th century for madmen. These complexes are trophies, the surviving legacy of the very civilization that was wiped off the face of the earth. Most likely, these were universities, sanatoriums, regeneration centers, or residential complexes for Tartary's elite. The new masters of the world simply seized these buildings, abandoned after the disaster, surrounded them with high fences, and installed bars on the windows. If you look closely at old photographs, you can see how out of place the crude iron bars look on the elegant arched windows. The bars were driven directly into the stucco, barbarically destroying the decor. This wasn't part of the original design. It was a hasty conversion of the seized property into a prison. There's another frightening detail: the lack of construction photographs. We are shown finished buildings, standing majestically amid wastelands or mud, but almost never the process of laying the foundations or erecting walls. We're told that this gigantic complex, housing thousands of wards, was built in 3 years by local masons using carts. But any engineer will tell you that with the technology of the time and the logistics of horse-drawn transport, constructing such a massive structure of brick and stone in such a short time frame was impossible. These buildings were already there. They were simply dug out from the aftermath of the mudflow, their facades washed, and their signs changed. The Institute of Etheric Physics became an asylum for the incurable. The Palace of Arts became Bedlam. Imagine the horror of someone being dragged down the marble steps of such a madhouse. He wasn't simply landing in prison. He was entering a distorted, twisted version of his past. Perhaps he studied in this building in his youth, when it was a university. Perhaps he lived here before the disaster. Now he walked through familiar corridors, where the glow of knowledge was replaced by the smell of bleach and fear, and guards with batons sat in his former offices. It was a sophisticated form of psychological torture, locking the keepers of memory within the monuments of their own culture, turning the grandeur of their ancestors into their own prison. The very architecture of these buildings, with their high ceilings and perfect acoustics, designed for resonance and harmony, now amplified the cries and groans of the prisoners, driving them truly mad. The system worked perfectly. The common people were led to believe that the government cared for the sick by building them palaces. But in reality, these were reservations. Using the prefabricated, incredibly durable buildings of Tartaria solved two problems at once. There was no need to spend money on constructing prisons of enormous capacity, and at the same time, the buildings were closed to the public. No outsider could enter and ask, "What are those strange mechanisms in the basement?" Or, "Why are there antennas on the roof instead of crosses?" The buildings were declared restricted areas, quarantine zones where entry was prohibited. Thus, the majestic legacy of the past was hidden in plain sight, reclassified from temples of science into houses of mourning. The new regime's most sophisticated weapon wasn't guns or prison bars, but medical jargon. To neutralize an enemy, you don't necessarily have to kill them. It's enough to convince those around you that their words are meaningless. Open the psychiatric archives of the mid-19th century, and you'll find an epidemic of strange, now extinct illnesses. One of the most common was nostalgia. Today, we consider it a mild ache for home, but in the 1860s, it was a deadly clinical diagnosis. Doctors earnestly described a brain inflammation caused by a longing for the past. Soldiers and settlers died from it by the thousands. But what past did they yearn for so intensely that their hearts stopped beating? It wasn't a longing for a wooden hut. It was the unbearable pain of people who remembered a golden age, abundance, and light, and who were forced to live in a gray, cold, coal-black world built on the bones of their ancestors. Nostalgia was dangerous to the system because it was contagious. One sick person telling the truth around a campfire could awaken the memories of dozens of listeners. Therefore, such people were immediately isolated and treated with opium and electric shocks until they forgot who they once were. An even more cynical invention was the diagnosis of drapetomania. Official history tells us that the term was coined by physician Samuel Cartwright to explain slaves' obsessive desire to escape. Supposedly, only a madman would want to escape a caring master. But in the context of the fall of Tartary, this diagnosis takes on a sinister global significance. Drapetomania was the label used for anyone who refused to accept the rules of the New World Order. Those who attempted to leave the controlled cities for the wild lands beyond the wall in search of surviving enclaves of free civilization. If you didn't want to work 16 hours a day in a factory, if you didn't believe in a new religion and a new history, if you felt the call of your ancestors and tried to find your way home, you were sick. The desire for freedom was declared a brain pathology requiring surgery. Doctors' offices of the time turned into courtrooms devoid of lawyers. Imagine an old-school engineer who survived a disaster. He sees the new scientists clumsily trying to start a steam engine, burning tons of coal. He approaches them and says, "You're being stupid. The ether is everywhere. All you need to do is install a resonator." In any normal civilization, he would have been listened to. But in 1870, he was dragged to a psychiatrist. The doctor asked a simple question, "Do you see what others don't?" The engineer replied, "I see streams of energy." The doctor made a note in his journal, "Visual hallucinations, delusions of invention." The person was declared dangerous to society, placed in a straitjacket, and sent to those very same palace prisons we mentioned earlier. Thus, a total purge of Tartary's intelligentsia was carried out. Bearers of technical knowledge, historians, keepers of genealogies, all of them fell under the millstones of punitive psychiatry. Their knowledge was discredited. If tomorrow someone found plans for an atmospheric generator signed with the name of a patient in a mental hospital, they would simply laugh at the scribbles of a madman. It was a brilliant strategy to hide the truth not in a safe, but in a folder with medical records. Any mention of giants was attributed to macropsia, a disorder of size perception. Any stories of telepathy or a unified information field were attributed to schizophrenia. The system created a hermetic dome of lies. Anyone who tried to pierce it with the truth was automatically labeled insane. The generation of witnesses did not die out on their own. They were gagged with chloroform and forced to remain silent until their death in padded cells. Behind high red brick walls, Far from prying eyes, 19th century medicine was transformed into an engineering program for reshaping the human mind. What was called treatment was in fact a series of sophisticated tortures, the purpose of which was one, to break the will. If the diagnosis of nostalgia was a legal justification for the arrest of memory, then the procedures in asylums were a means of physically destroying it. Doctors of the time openly wrote that their task was to shock the brain to return it to a normal state. But what exactly were they beating out of their patients' heads? One of the most popular procedures was rotation therapy, a rotating chair invented at the beginning of the century but only becoming widespread during the purges. A patient would be strapped to the chair and spun at monstrous speeds for hours until their ears and nose began to bleed and their consciousness would black out from the overload. Officially, this was supposed to rearrange thoughts. In reality, this destroyed the vestibular system and the neural connections responsible for spatial and temporal orientation. After the session, the person forgot not only about Tartary, they forgot their own name. It was like a forced formatting of the hard drive, turning the personality into a blank slate. Equally terrifying was hydrotherapy. It sounds like a spa treatment, but in the 1860s, it meant torture with ice water. Patients who spoke too loudly about the past were kept in baths of crushed ice for days, or conversely, wrapped in sheets soaked in boiling water until they were completely dehydrated. This was called pacification of the violent. The body, in a state of constant thermal shock, switched to animal survival mode. Higher cognitive functions were disabled. The person ceased to be a philosopher, engineer, or guardian of the family line. They became simply a trembling body, ready to accept any truth as long as the pain stopped. Thus, the proud heirs of a great empire were turned into obedient slaves. But the crowning glory of this system was surgery. Toward the end of the century, when simple torture could no longer cope with the influx of rememberers, lobotomy and its predecessors entered the arsenal. This barbaric intervention in the frontal lobes of the brain, the seat of personality, will, and creativity. With this instrument, the doctors of the New World literally excised the soul. After such an operation, the patient became quiet, comfortable, and completely empty. They could perform simple mechanical work, eat, and sleep, but they never again asked questions about who built these buildings or why the borders on the maps had changed. It was a biorobot factory. The personality-erasing technologies worked flawlessly. Thousands of the brightest minds, who could have rebuilt civilization after the catastrophe, were turned into vegetables. Their knowledge, their experience with etheric technologies, their memory of true history, all of it was destroyed by scalpel and electric shock. And when you see old photos of psychiatric patients with empty, vacant stares, know this: these are not madmen. They are victims of the largest mental war in human history, losing the battle for their memories. The final act of this tragedy unfolded not in torture chambers, but in the silence of empty children's rooms. Now that we see the full picture, the sinister connection between the construction of gigantic insane asylums and the launch of the infamous orphan trains becomes clear. These were not two distinct social phenomena, but the two hands of a single surgeon performing an operation to amputate human memory. The logic of the new elites was impeccable and ruthless. To rewrite history, it was not enough to destroy books. The living chain of knowledge, transmission from parents to children, had to be severed. The mechanism worked like clockwork. As soon as the head of a family was declared insane for talking about free energy, or Great Tartary, he was stripped of his parental rights. His wife, if she tried to defend her husband, faced the same fate, a diagnosis of hysteria and a one-way ticket to the hospice. Children left without care automatically became the property of the state. They weren't killed, they were a valuable resource for building a new world. They were loaded onto trains and sent thousands of miles to the Wild West or remote colonies, where they were given to foster families on farms as free labor. These children's pasts were erased even more effectively than their parents. Their last names were changed, they were given new documents, and they were told legends about their parents dying in a fire, the plague, or being alcoholics. A child, torn from their familiar environment at an early age, quickly forgot the details. And if they did recall anything strange, for example, giant glowing cities or gentle giants, the new teachers and priests quickly explained that these were childish fantasies and fairy tales. Thus, a perfect generation gap was created. By 1900, the world was filled with millions of young people who didn't know their roots, didn't remember their real names, and believed only what was written in the new, freshly printed history textbooks. Adults, locked in yellow houses, died in complete isolation. They screamed the truth into the padded walls, but no one heard them. Their children, who might have heard them, were now building railroads for the Rockefellers and praying to new gods, unaware that their real fathers and mothers were rotting alive in luxurious prison palaces just a few states away. The connection between time and time was broken. Knowledge of etheric technologies, of harmony with nature, of the planet's true past, died with the last patient of that era. Today, abandoned psychiatric hospitals stand like giant tombstones over the grave of common sense. We walk their echoing corridors with cameras, filming Ghostbusters, and feel an inexplicable dread. But it's not a fear of ghosts, it's genetic memory screaming within us. These walls remember the greatest crime in history, how an entire generation of guardians was declared insane so that their descendants would become obedient cogs in someone else's machine. And perhaps the true madness is that we still believe the official version of their construction, continuing to live in the very illusion created for us a century and a half ago.